Hello. As an adult, I recognize that my story of childhood was a tragedy. But as a child, going through what I was going through, I didn't have the capacity. And the reason is that human beings have an unbelievable capacity for normalization. We can go through the most difficult things imaginable and continue walking through our life. My sexual abuse started at age 5, and it went on for a decade until I was 15. And every friend that I had growing up that was close to me was sexually abused by the same person. And a lot of times when I tell my story, I get the question of, and where were your parents during this time? And I have to say that they were exactly where they are tonight, which is here. Yeah. Yeah, mom and dad. They saw the signs, they saw the symptoms, and they took me to professionals. And I wasn't ready to tell my story. But when I was, I knew at least 2 people that I could go to. So my wall of normalization lasted for quite a while. The adaptations that I came up with as a very small child lasted a surprisingly long time until I was about 12. And when I was 12, things started to slowly come unfolded. It was when I started abusing alcohol and when I started abusing drugs. And I began self-injuring. And I started having consensual but inappropriate sexual relationships. And I was severely, severely depressed. And I remember walking through my middle school, and I would play a game with myself every day of how long will it take for somebody to notice me, right? Because I just felt invisible, and I was looking for confirmation that it was okay for me to just leave the world. And so my abuse went on for another 3 years after that. It ended when I was 15. And by the time I got there, I was not in a good way. But this is the end of the 90s, the early 2000s era, and that was the time where miniseries, you remember miniseries? They were like coming to an end, and the Lifetime movie was coming about. And there was there always came in like themes, so it was like earthquakes, and everyone would do earthquakes, or tornadoes, and everyone would do. And one of them that was my favorite one was The Intervention. And the story was always the same. So it's like Susan is the leader of the cheerleading squad, and everything falls apart because Susan started using heroin. And my favorite part of the movie, all of them are the same. My favorite part of the movie was when Susan would come home and her family would be sitting in front of her, and she'd go, "Oh crap." And she'd run for the door, but Susan's mom would get up and grab her by the arm, and she'd pull her in, and Susan would struggle. And then she would cry. And then the rest of the family would come around, and they would just say, "We love you. Please let us help you. Please let us help you." And as a kid, that was my fantasy. Yeah. And in that, I created a story that I could survive. So my intervention came at 16. And I went to my parents, right, because they've always been there. And we talk a lot about in the mental health field about creating scaffolding for young people, that if they're not ready to do the construction today, can we set them up to do it in the future? And that's exactly what happened. I entered into what we call recovery at age 16. I was extremely blessed to have some incredible resources available to me as an adolescent, that many of which are still available today. And from the beginning of my recovery, people pretty frequently were saying to me, like, you probably should go to therapy, right? There's because I'd been through a lot, and I wasn't hiding my abuse from anyone, but my whole thinking about therapy was like, I went through 10 years of that. What does a therapist have to tell me, right? And flawed or not, that was my feeling. And what that was a continuation of normalization. It was a continuation of a survival strategy that I just picked up again. And it worked. It worked for about 3.5 years. And I was confronted again with a come apart. And I had a decision at that point in time of either, even though I was young, I can either start over at the beginning or I can try to nip this in the bud. And so I decided to do that. So I went to treatment again, and this time I went specifically for trauma. And drove myself down to New Orleans and stayed for 30 days at a place with people just like me. And I found out that everyone minimizes their trauma. We all do it. It's a way that we survive it, is to make it smaller. And I learned to tell my story, and I learned to breathe. And I came back to Nashville a new person, and I had the opportunity to go to therapy at Sexual Assault Center. And for those of you who don't know what Sexual Assault Center is, it is probably one of Nashville's greatest jewels. It is a nonprofit that focuses on the advocacy and treatment of sexual assault survivors for Davidson County, and they are literal angels. And I'll say this real quickly, that one time I was waiting on my appointment with my therapist at Sexual Assault Center. I was looking at one of the pamphlets, and it said, this is our mission statement. Sexual Assault Center's mission statement is to end sexual violence, period. Yeah. And I asked my therapist about that, and he said, why would we set our goal any lower? And so I started therapy, and I met some incredible men, and I started to get better. I stopped having nightmares and waking up in cold sweats. I stopped feeling as alone. I stopped feeling as crazy. And I went to Sexual Assault Center for 2 years on scholarship. 2 years on scholarship because I couldn't afford to pay for that much therapy. I got to the end of the 2 years, and my therapist confronted me, and he said, look, we've gone a long way. I've seen you through a lot of things, but the reality of it is that you have plateaued, and I see that there is some growth left to do. So I'm supportive of you, but I'm supportive of you in the change process. So what do you want to do? And so I remembered from when I went to trauma treatment, there was this therapy called dialectical behavior therapy. And I didn't remember a dang thing about dialectical behavior therapy except for this. It came with a giant binder with tons and tons of worksheets and handouts and all this stuff. And I was like, if I can just get my hands on that sucker, I can memorize all that crap. Because there's all sorts of coping mechanisms and skills and yada, yada, yada. And so that's what I did. I sought out a therapist. And I prepared for therapy in only a way that a neurotic perfectionist can, which is that I bought some very expensive software for mind mapping. And if you don't know what mind mapping is, it's an elaborate way of diagramming. So I've got this software, and I prepared for my first therapy session by creating a diagram. At the very center of it, it said, "What's wrong with Karl?" And then literally, I'm not exaggerating, probably 250 points around what is Karl were points color-coded of possibilities. Right? So it was, depression and trauma and yada, yada, yada. And the whole point was that I was done with the equation in my head of what the heck do I do? And so I went to therapy, and I sat down with her, and I was feeling very full of myself. I was slid the diagram across her. I was like, you might need this. And she looked at me in that very therapist way, and she went, I just might. Yeah. And she put it in the file, never to be seen again. And so I entered into dialectical behavior therapy, and pretty quickly my therapist picked up on my game of memorization, and she was confronted me on it pretty early on and said, you do realize that you actually have to do this stuff, right? You can't just memorize the worksheets. And I was like, well, come on, Debbie Downer over here. Well, I know now. And so I practiced these worksheets. And as I practiced what was on these worksheets, I was learning these skills that were helping me to redesign my brain in ways that I really hadn't anticipated when I was just looking for a binder to memorize. I learned that not only could I practice a skill to get through a really hard time, I actually can reprogram my brain through action. Yeah. And so to say that, and I'll say this, I was very defiant about psychotropic medicines, especially antidepressants, and I will happily say I am on antidepressants today and I am compliant. But during this time, I didn't want to for whatever reason. A part of my story was just that I needed to do that. And I will tell you that I went from major depression, severe, to mild, just with the therapy. And so here's the problem, though. Every time I would go to therapy, my therapist and I would sit down, and I would always want to bring the chart back up. What's wrong with Karl? What's wrong with Karl? What's wrong with Karl? And my therapist confronted me one day, and we sat down. She said, look, we're not going to do things like normal today. We're going to do something different. And honest to God, my first thought was, oh my God, she's about to fire me. I was like, oh my God, like she's literally about to fire me. What a loser. Oh man. And she said, no, like, look, Karl, what if there's nothing wrong with you? And then I really wanted to pull out the chart. Okay, pull it out. Like there's 250 points. Okay, I'll color number 16A in hot pink on the left-hand side. Tell me that ain't something wrong with me, right? And she said, no, listen to me. What if there's nothing wrong with you? What if you were just trying to build a life worth living? And this floored me. It absolutely floored me. Because my whole idea of survival at this point was about the chart. If I can just find out what the hell is wrong with me, then maybe I can have some freedom. It never occurred to me that maybe there's not anything. Maybe I am just valiantly trying to build a life worth living. There's no magical answer at the end of this. That's the path I still am on right now, of stepping into what does recovery look like without the idea something's wrong with me. And that's the path that I will probably continue from here on. Thank you.